The silence in the garage that morning was the wrong kind of silence. Not the peaceful kind that settles after a long day, not the kind that comes between songs on the radio. It was the silence of something held too long, the kind that waits. Dean Holt had been standing in front of the same car for 11 minutes. He knew because the clock on the wall, the one with the cracked face that his daughter had taped back together with a strip of blue masking tape, had moved from 7:02 to 7:13 while he did nothing but look. The car was a 1989 Lamborghini Countach, pearl white, and it had not started in 3 years. It belonged to a man named Preston Vaughn. Most people in Cedarwell, Kentucky, knew the name the way they knew the name of the county or the river. Not because they'd ever spoken to him directly, but because his presence shaped the landscape. His family had been in the region for 4 generations. They'd owned the mill before it closed, then the land after, and now Preston ran something in finance that nobody in town fully understood, but everyone respected because of the house it had built on the ridge overlooking the valley. The house had 8 bedrooms, a greenhouse, and a garage that could hold 14 cars. The Countach had been one of 42 vehicles in that collection. Dean had been hired not for the Countach, not at first. He'd been called in to look at a Porsche 930 that had developed an oil leak. He fixed it in 2 days. Preston's property manager, a quiet man named Thomas Briggs, had asked if he'd be willing to take a look at a few others. Dean said yes. A week turned into 3, and then Thomas had walked him to the far end of the garage, past the covered shapes of cars that cost more than most people's homes, and stopped at the one car that sat uncovered, as if it had given up on being protected. "This one's been looked at by 4 different people," Thomas said. "Ferrari specialist out of Nashville. 2 guys from a shop in Lexington. 1 man who flew in from Atlanta who charged $8,000 just to come look at it and left without fixing anything." Dean had stood in front of the Countach and said nothing for a while. "What's wrong with it?" he'd asked. Thomas shook his head slowly. "That's the problem. Nobody can figure out what's wrong with it." Dean Holt was 41 years old. He had grown up in Cedarwell, left for 12 years, and come back carrying less than he'd left with. He'd spent those 12 years as a powertrain systems engineer at a mid-size automotive firm in Ohio, the kind of work that required him to understand not just how engines functioned, but why they failed. He'd been good at it. He'd been better than good. He had 3 patents filed under his name and had led a team that resolved a thermal expansion issue in a diesel line that had cost the company 2 years and more money than he was ever told directly. He'd come back to Cedarwell because of Patrice. His wife had been diagnosed when their daughter was 4 years old. They'd spent 2 years fighting it together, then 1 year with Dean fighting most of it alone, because Patrice had stopped being able to fight by then, and then she was gone, and his daughter Becca was 6, and Dean was 38, and standing in the parking lot of a hospital in Dayton, Ohio, trying to remember where he had parked the car. He moved back to Cedarwell because it was the only place he could think of where the ground felt like it would hold. He opened the garage with his savings. It wasn't much. A small building on the edge of town, the kind of place that had been a tire shop in a previous life. He put in 2 lifts, a tool bench, and a coffee maker. He painted the name on the sign himself, in the same dark blue that Patrice had once called her favorite color. Most of his customers brought him domestic trucks and sedans with ordinary problems. He charged fairly and worked carefully and didn't talk much. The people of Cedarwell trusted him not because he was charming, but because he was precise. He said what he would do, and then he did it, and the cars ran when they left his shop. He brought Becca with him most days. She was 9 now. She did her homework on a fold-out table in the corner of the garage while Dean worked, wearing a pair of over-ear headphones that were slightly too large for her head, the left cup sitting at a small tilt because she'd bent the band trying to adjust it once. She never complained about being there. She had her mother's temperament, unhurried, observant, willing to wait. Some evenings she'd look up from her workbook and watch him for a while without saying anything. He didn't always notice. But when he did, he felt it the way you feel afternoon light, not as a specific warmth, but as a presence. The Countach's problem was that it had no problem, or rather, every diagnostic tool said it had no problem, and yet it would not start. The car had a 5.2-liter V12 engine, fuel injection retrofitted to the original carbureted system at some point in its history, and an electrical system that had been partially rewired by one of the previous mechanics who had apparently believed the original wiring was at fault. The battery was new. The starter motor was new. The fuel pump had been replaced. The ignition system had been replaced. The ECU in the retrofitted injection setup had been replaced. The car sat there like a question with no answer written underneath it. Dean came back to the Vaughn property 3 mornings in a row before he said anything. He sat in the driver's seat. He got out and lay on the floor. He stood at the front and looked at nothing for long stretches of time. Thomas Briggs checked in on him once and found him cross-legged on the floor beside the passenger wheel well, reading a wiring diagram on a paper he'd printed from a database, with a pen behind his ear and an untouched cup of coffee going cold beside him. "You eat?" Thomas asked. "I will," Dean said, without looking up. On the 4th morning, Becca was with him. It was a Saturday. She set up her homework table near the back wall of the Vaughn garage, far enough not to be in the way, and opened her math workbook. She had her headphones on. Dean barely registered that she was there. He was under the car, not looking for the obvious things. Those had all been checked. He was following a line of reasoning that had started 2 nights before, at 11:30, when he'd woken up from a half-sleep with the shape of a thought in his mind that wasn't fully formed yet. He'd lain there in the dark and followed it. It had to do with the retrofit. When someone adds fuel injection to a car that was originally carbureted, they are solving one problem and introducing the conditions for another. The new system speaks a different language than the original. Most of the time, the translation is good enough. But if the grounding points between the original electrical architecture and the new system are imperfect, not broken, not corroded, just slightly mismatched in their reference voltages, the ECU can enter a state that looks, from the outside, like everything is fine. Everything reads correctly. Every sensor returns a valid signal. The starter engages. The fuel pump pressurizes the line. And then nothing. Not because the engine is broken, because the engine doesn't believe it has permission to run. Dean had read about this failure mode in a technical paper 8 years ago. It was rare. It required a specific set of conditions, a partial retrofit, an original grounding architecture that was just old enough to have drifted from spec, and a replacement ECU that happened to use a slightly different voltage threshold for its enable signal. The probability of all 3 occurring together was low enough that most mechanics never encountered it. The mechanics who had looked at this car before him were good mechanics. They had simply never seen this before. He found the ground point in question under the car, tucked behind a bracket near the driver's side firewall. When he touched it, it looked clean. It measured clean. But when he brought the oscilloscope down and watched the signal over time, not a snapshot, not a single reading, but the actual waveform over 30 seconds, he saw it adrift, small, periodic, rhythmic as breathing. He put the oscilloscope down on the floor of the garage. He sat there for a moment with his back against the underside of the car. Becca had taken her headphones off at some point. He didn't know when. She was looking at him from across the garage, her chin resting in both hands, her elbows on the fold-out table. "Did you find it?" she asked. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "I think I found it." He didn't tell Thomas Briggs immediately. He went home, ate dinner with Becca, helped her finish a reading assignment about the water cycle, and sat at the kitchen table after she'd gone to bed with a yellow legal pad and worked through the repair sequence from start to finish. He drew it out. He listed every part he would need to replace or modify. He wrote down the order of operations. He crossed out 2 steps and rewrote them. He did this because he'd learned a long time ago that the distance between finding the problem and fixing the problem was not always as short as it looked. He had fixed cars on incomplete confidence before. It had cost him time and once a customer. He was not interested in doing that again. By the time he finished, it was past midnight. He looked at the legal pad. The solution was simple. It was almost embarrassingly simple. A grounding correction, a recalibration of the ECU's, enable threshold, using the original system's voltage reference, and a replacement of 2 short sections of wiring that had absorbed just enough resistance over 35 years to push the signal below the threshold the new ECU expected. He folded the legal pad. He put it in his jacket pocket. He went to bed. He was back at the Vaughn property the next morning at 7:30. Thomas Briggs watched him work. Not the whole time. Thomas was a busy man and had other things to attend to. But he checked in at intervals, the way a person checks on something they're half afraid to hope for. He brought Dean coffee at 9 and found him under the car, working with a precision that looked, from the outside, almost slow. Every movement deliberate, nothing rushed. "You know what it is?" Thomas asked. "I think so," Dean said. He didn't elaborate. By 11, he had made the corrections. He reseated the wiring. He recalibrated the ECU, using a process that required patience more than tools, cycling through the system, measuring, adjusting, waiting, measuring again. Becca was in the corner. Her homework had been finished for an hour. She was reading a library book with a horse on the cover. She looked up when Dean stood up from the floor. He sat in the driver's seat. He put his hand on the key. He did not turn it immediately. He sat for a moment the way a person sits before doing something they've been waiting to do for a long time. Then he turned the key. The engine did not turn over. It started, not with effort, not with hesitation. It simply opened its throat and produced a sound that filled the garage completely, a sound that had been absent for 3 years, a sound that was, underneath all its mechanical complexity, just the sound of something that had been waiting to be understood. The sound moved through the floor and up through the legs of the fold-out table and into Becca's elbows where they rested on the surface. She felt it before she processed it. She looked up from her book. She looked at the car. She looked at her father. He was sitting in the driver's seat of the running Lamborghini, both hands loose in his lap, looking straight ahead through the windshield at the garage wall. He wasn't smiling. He looked like a man who had just remembered something important. Thomas Briggs had come out of the main house. He was standing in the doorway at the far end of the garage with his jacket half on, frozen in the motion of putting it on. One of the groundskeepers who had been working the east side of the property was standing behind him, not quite inside the garage, looking over Thomas's shoulder. Dean turned the engine off. He stepped out of the car. He set the key on the roof. Thomas walked toward him slowly, the way people walk when they're not entirely sure what they're walking toward. "That's..." Thomas started. "Grounding issue," Dean said. Original system and the retrofit ECU had a voltage reference mismatch. It was creating a false idle condition. The ECU was reading everything as nominal, but not receiving a valid permission signal within its threshold range. So it never initialized the ignition sequence. Thomas stared at him. "Nobody found that," Thomas said. "It was not a question." "It's a specific failure mode," Dean said. "You'd only know to look for it if you'd seen it before or read about it. The previous mechanics were doing their jobs. They weren't wrong about anything. They just hadn't encountered this particular combination of factors." Thomas was quiet for a moment. $8,000, he said. "That's what we paid one man just to come look at it." Dean picked up his tools. He began putting them back in the case in the order they belonged. "What do we owe you?" Thomas asked. Dean thought about it. "Same rate as the Porsche," he said. Thomas looked at him. "Dean, that's not." "Same rate as the Porsche," Dean said again, without looking up from his tool case. Preston Vaughn came to the garage 3 days later. Not the Vaughn garage on the Ridge property. Dean's garage, the small one on the edge of Cedarwell, with the dark blue sign and the cracked face clock. He came alone, without Thomas, without any of the property staff. He drove himself in a dark gray sedan that cost considerably more than anything else in Dean's parking lot. He stepped out wearing the kind of clothes that looked casual until you looked at them carefully. Dean was underneath a 2008 Ford F-150 when he heard the car pull in. He came out from under the truck and stood up. He was wiping his hands on a shop rag. Preston Vaughn was approximately 60 years old, with the posture of a man who had spent decades in rooms where posture mattered. He looked around the garage with a kind of considered attention, the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand rather than evaluate. "Mr. Holt," he said. "Mr. Vaughn," Dean said. They looked at each other for a moment. "I wanted to come myself," Preston said. "Thomas told me what you found. I've been thinking about it for 3 days. He paused. "That car hasn't run since my wife was alive." Dean said nothing. He held the shop rag in both hands. "She drove it," Preston said. "She was the one who wanted it, if you can believe that. Couldn't have cared less about the others. But that one, she saw a picture of it in a magazine when she was young and decided she was going to have one someday." He looked away from Dean toward the garage wall. "She had it for 2 years before it stopped starting. And then she got sick. And after, I didn't want to sell it, but I also couldn't look at it for a long time. When I finally could, I tried to get it fixed and nobody could." He stopped. I'm not sure what I'm trying to say, he said. You don't have to say anything, Dean said. No, Preston said. I do. He looked at Dean directly. Thomas told me about your wife. I'm sorry, I didn't know. Dean nodded once. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked back up. The car runs well, Dean said. The engine is strong. Whoever did the original retrofit knew what they were doing, aside from the grounding point. It'll need regular attention, but there's nothing fundamentally wrong with it. Preston nodded. I'd like to bring you the others, he said. Not all at once, but over time, if you're willing. Dean looked at him. I charge the same rate for everyone, he said. Preston almost smiled. I know. Thomas told me that too. Becca appeared from behind the tool bench, where she had apparently been doing something with a piece of copper wire that Dean hadn't noticed. She looked at Preston Vaughn with the direct, unabashed attention of a 9-year-old who has not yet learned that it can be impolite to study people. Preston looked at her. What's your name? He asked. Becca, she said. Do you like cars? She considered this seriously. I like being around my dad when he fixes them, she said. I don't know if I like cars specifically. Preston laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite one. It changed his face. That's an honest answer, he said. The story of the Countach spread through Cedarwell the way small town stories spread. Slowly, and then all at once. Thomas Briggs mentioned it to a friend. The friend mentioned it to someone else. The groundskeeper who had been standing in the doorway told his brother-in-law, who told 3 people at the feed store. What people heard varied somewhat. Some versions had Dean diagnosing the car in a single morning. Some versions had him refusing a large sum of money. The amounts increased as the story traveled. One version had Preston Vaughn driving the Countach through town himself, which wasn't true, but had enough emotional logic to persist. What was true was smaller and larger at the same time. What was true was a man who had spent 12 years learning how things work and why they stop working, and had then spent 3 more years putting himself back together in a small garage in a small town, and had not forgotten anything he'd learned along the way. What was true was a fault that had stumped 4 specialists, found by a man sitting on a concrete floor with an oscilloscope and a yellow legal pad, and no particular urgency, except the ordinary urgency of wanting to understand a problem completely. What was true was a 9-year-old girl at a fold-out table, with slightly too large headphones and a horsebook, who had felt the vibration of the engine through her elbows before she heard it with her ears. What was true was the sound. Dean didn't change much after that. He opened the garage at the same time. He fixed the same kinds of cars. He still charged the same rate for everyone, which people in Cedarwell mentioned sometimes as a point of character, the way they mentioned that he always held the door and never said anything bad about anyone directly. He took on 3 of the Vaughn vehicles over the following months. A 1972 Maserati Bora with a failing cooling system. A 1967 Ford GT40 that had a persistent misfire he traced to a combination of incorrect spark plug gap and a distributor that had been worn by 30,000 miles of improper timing. A 1985 Ferrari 308 GTS with an ignition amplifier that had been replaced with the wrong part by someone who hadn't verified the resistance specifications. Each one took time. Each one required him to go slow where other people had gone fast, to look longer before touching anything, to trust the process over the impulse. Each one ran when it left. Thomas Briggs drove the Ferrari 308 out of Dean's garage on a Tuesday afternoon in October, with the window down and the engine producing a sound that turned heads on Maple Street. Dean was standing in the bay door. He watched the car until it disappeared around the corner at the end of the block. Becca came and stood beside him. She'd been doing math at her table. She looked at the space where the car had been. That one sounded different, she said. Every car sounds different, Dean said. I know, she said. I mean, it sounded like it was happy. He looked at her. She was looking at the empty street with her usual expression. Unhurried, considering, as if she had all the time in the world to decide what she thought. He put his hand on the top of her head for a moment. Then he went back inside. Later, much later, after Becca had gone home on the school bus, and the last truck of the day had been finished, and the garage was quiet in the good way, the way that follows work rather than precedes it. Dean sat on the workbench with a cup of coffee and looked at nothing in particular. He thought about what Thomas had said that first morning. Nobody found that. He had thought about it more than he expected to. Not with pride, exactly. More with something like wonder. At the specific combination of circumstances that had placed a rare failure mode in front of the one person in the county who had happened to read a technical paper about it 8 years before. At the strangeness of preparation meeting opportunity in a place as small as Cedarwell, Kentucky. At the way problems wait, sometimes for years, for the person who can see them. The clock on the wall read 6:49. The crack ran through the 5 and the 6, neatly repaired with blue tape. He finished his coffee. He turned off the light. Outside, the evening was coming down over the valley in layers, the hilltops first, then the fields, then the long flat stretch of road that ran through the center of town. Somewhere on the ridge, in a garage that could hold 14 cars, a white Lamborghini was parked in the space it had occupied for 3 years. It had run that morning. It would run tomorrow. And the one who had made that possible was driving home on a road he'd known his whole life, thinking about nothing in particular, and everything at once, with a cracked-face clock on the wall behind him, and a fold-out table with a slight lean and a daughter who had felt an engine start before she heard it. Some things don't need an audience to matter. Some things just need to be done right.